It began with whispers, not lightning, not thunder, just whispers. Soft, unsettling rumors floated through the halls of St. Arabelle's convent like incense, delicate but choking. She's gaining weight. Her robes don't fit right anymore. She's been sick every morning for weeks. One nun could be excused. Two might be a coincidence. But when the fourth sister, quiet, innocent Sister Cecilia, collapsed during evening prayer, clutching her stomach and whispering, "I'm sorry, Father," the truth no longer had the luxury of being ignored. The women were pregnant, and no one could explain how. The year was 1980. The village of Belwick was the kind of place that time forgot. Quiet, sun-baked, nestled between rolling hills and misplaced woods in northern Vermont. It had no hospital, no police station, not even a stoplight, just a school, a bakery, and a chapel. That chapel, St. Arabelle's, was the soul of it all. A white stone church with blood-red windows, surrounded by flower beds and silence. It was the place where people were born, baptized, and buried. It was also the last place anyone expected a scandal. So, when rumors spread that 4 nuns had become mysteriously pregnant, the village didn't know what to do. They whispered behind closed doors. They stared from windows. They showed up to Mass, not for prayer, but for proof. But the biggest shock wasn't that the sisters were expecting. It was that they wouldn't say a word about how it happened. Father Elric was 42 at the time, silver-haired, soft-voiced, and fiercely respected. He had served Belwick for 19 years, starting as a young seminary graduate and slowly becoming more than a priest, a symbol of peace, structure, and moral clarity. His sermons were poetic, his discipline firm but fair. He had no enemies, no scandals, not even a parking ticket. So, when the first nun showed signs of pregnancy, Father Elric was devastated. When the second did, he wept. By the third, he begged the diocese to investigate, but the Vatican sent no one. No one came. By the fourth, Sister Cecilia, he stopped asking. He simply prayed. The sisters, Lucia, Miriam, Beatrice, and Cecilia, were moved to a private wing of the convent for health reasons, they said, but no one believed it. Villagers began showing up near the gates at night just to watch. Reporters from Boston sniffed their way to Belwick and were quickly turned away. Then, one morning in mid-June, just as mysteriously as the pregnancies had appeared, all 4 women vanished. No goodbyes, no notes, no footprints, no cries. The beds were cold, the sheets folded, the doors locked from the inside. Gone. The chapel didn't hold a memorial. Father Elric didn't speak of it. The church gave no statement. A week later, the convent closed for renovations. The story was buried not just metaphorically, but physically. Newspaper archives were removed, diaries confiscated, families warned. The village moved on, or pretended to, until 10 years later, when an old maintenance worker restoring the chapel basement for a historical grant pulled up a cracked slab of stone and found something that made him vomit on the spot. The slab was thick, old, cracked with time. Beneath it, just a few inches down, was something not meant to be touched again, not meant to ever be seen. The worker's name was Glenn Rock, 67 years old, arthritic, half-blind in one eye. He'd been called to restore the undercroft beneath St. Arabelle's for a state-funded preservation grant. The church had recently decided to reopen the convent wing as a historical site, or so they claimed. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but the air down there was wrong. Too still, too thick, like the walls were holding their breath. He was scraping near the far end, just behind the altar's foundation, when the chisel struck something. Hollow. He paused, scraped again. Hollow, definitely hollow. Beneath the faint echo was the unmistakable rattle of old, dry bone. At first, they assumed it was a single body, maybe a priest from centuries ago, interred beneath the chapel in a forgotten tradition. But when the county coroner arrived and they carefully lifted the stone, they discovered 4 partial skeletons, all adult women, curled into fetal positions, arms crossed. Beside each one was a single object, a rosary. Each rosary had a name inscribed: Lucia, Miriam, Beatrice, Cecilia. The news exploded through Belwick like wildfire doused in gasoline. 10 years of uneasy silence cracked open overnight. People who once whispered about scandal now stood outside the chapel in dozens, demanding answers. At the center of the storm was one man, the only man who had been there through it all: Father Elric. Now 52, the priest looked nearly 20 years older than he had a decade ago. His hair was entirely white, his voice, when heard, raspy and quiet. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He simply said, "I have nothing to confess." But no one believed him. The diocese launched an internal inquiry. A special forensic team was brought in, and Belwick became the center of one of the most unusual cold cases in modern church history. Every resident was interviewed. Dozens of former church employees were tracked down. Yet, there was nothing. No fingerprints, no blood, no clear cause of death, no sign of trauma. It was as if the women had simply lain down, curled up, and died peacefully, quietly, together. But then came the journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the old nuns' quarters, preserved by the dry air, yellowed with time. It was a slim, leather-bound book, unlabeled, but the handwriting was delicate, careful. It belonged to Sister Beatrice. The entries began 4 months before the pregnancies, normal at first, prayers, routines, small frustrations. Then something shifted. He visits more often now. He always brings tea. He says, "God gives second chances to the lonely." And then, "I know it's wrong, but it feels like love." He promised we'd be safe. Lucia is showing signs now too. The final entry read, "He says he'll protect us, that this is sacred." But something in his eyes has changed. I think we made a mistake. The journal was enough to reopen the case publicly. The media returned. TV crews camped outside. National papers printed headlines: The Belwick Four, Pregnant Nuns, and a Priest's Silence. Still, Father Elric said nothing. No interviews, no sermons, just daily walks through the churchyard, alone, silent, as if waiting for something. Then, on the 10th anniversary of the day the nuns vanished, he did something no one expected. He scheduled a funeral mass for all 4 women and invited the entire town. The chapel was packed that evening. People stood shoulder to shoulder, packed into pews and aisles, breathless, waiting. Elric stood at the pulpit, silent for nearly a full minute. Then he looked up and said, "10 years ago, 4 women trusted me, and I failed them." The chapel was completely silent. Father Elric's voice, once commanding, now trembled under the weight of his words. 10 years ago, 4 women trusted me, and I failed them." Gasps echoed through the room. Some stood frozen, others instinctively crossed themselves. But what followed wasn't a confession, not fully. He spoke of the pressure, the shame, the church's silence, how he begged the diocese to send help when the pregnancies emerged, and how they responded with nothing but silence. He painted himself as a man abandoned by the very system he served. "I tried to protect them. I prayed night after night. I begged for answers I never got, and then one by one they disappeared." He paused. "And now they are found. But answers remain buried." Outside the church, opinion was split. Some believed Elric, others saw right through the performance. The funeral mass did one thing, though. It put the case back in the public eye. Detectives from the Vermont Cold Case Bureau were brought in, and this time they weren't interested in spiritual answers. They wanted evidence. They searched every inch of the church, the convent, and the rectory where Elric had lived. What they found was unsettling. Behind the library wall was a narrow crawl space, a hidden corridor sealed from both ends. Inside were discarded habits, stained prayer books, and a small, threadbare mattress, clearly used. It hadn't been mentioned in any church blueprints, a space never meant to exist. DNA samples taken from the items were sent to the lab. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with questions. Who had used that room? Was it where the sisters had stayed before vanishing? Or was it where someone had hidden them? The diary entries kept surfacing. Investigators discovered another journal, this one belonging to Sister Miriam. He told me it was love. He said he'd never touched anyone before, that I was chosen. But now Lucia won't speak to me. She's afraid. I don't think we're the only ones. A pattern was emerging, but there were still no hard facts, no fingerprints. On the rosaries, no signs of trauma on the bones, no official charges to press. The village once again began to turn on itself. A former housekeeper named Lorna came forward anonymously. She used to clean the convent and rectory, and she remembered things. Late-night footsteps, whispers behind closed doors, and a strange schedule that made no sense. 4 nuns visited the priest's quarters on separate days, always leaving quietly. She never saw anything directly, but she remembered the fear in their eyes, especially Cecilia's. She looked at me once like she wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just nodded and walked away. As the investigation deepened, one question returned again and again. Why didn't they speak up? Why didn't any of the sisters ever expose the truth? Why hide it? Why protect it? Or who were they afraid of? One day, an envelope was slid beneath the rectory door. No postage, no return address, just a small handwritten note inside. You'll never find what's buried under guilt. Taped to the bottom was a photograph, blurry, faded, but clear enough to see. 5 people, 4 women in habits, and in the middle, a man in priest's robes, smiling, his hand resting on Sister Beatrice's shoulder. The date scribbled on the back. May 3rd, 1980, 6 weeks before the disappearances. The man in the photo wasn't Father Elric. He was someone else entirely, a visiting priest, young, tall, dark-haired. There had been no record of any other clergy assigned to Belwick at the time, but now someone new had entered the frame, someone whose name had been wiped from church logs, someone who had once stood smiling, right in the center of the tragedy. The photograph changed everything. It arrived without a sound, without a name, just slipped under the rectory door like a forgotten sin. 4 nuns, 1 unfamiliar priest, all smiling, except Beatrice. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She looked tense, like she knew something, like she didn't belong in that moment or didn't want to be there at all. But the man in the middle radiated charm, confident, young, hands resting gently on both shoulders, and most importantly, not. Father Elric. Detectives scoured diocesan archives for any record of visiting clergy in the spring of 1980. At first, nothing came up. But then, tucked away in an old filing cabinet in the state bishop's office, was a faded memo dated April 10th, 1980. It mentioned a temporary transfer to Belwick Parish. Name, Father Romuald Ferran. Duration, April 15th to June 8th, 1980. No other details, no reasons listed, just 2 months. And then, nothing. When they asked Father Elric about Ferran, he hesitated for the first time. Yes, he came for a short time, he said. Said he was here for sabbatical reflection, very charismatic, always quoting scripture. He paused. The sisters liked him. He didn't say anything more, but his knuckles turned white around the edge of the pew as he spoke. A deeper investigation revealed something chilling. Father Romuald Ferran had been transferred 5 times in 3 years. Each parish he'd served in had filed no formal complaints, but each had records wiped or redacted. In each case, female parishioners, often young, vulnerable, or within the convent, had left the order soon after. Nothing criminal, but the pattern was poisonous. In Belwick, Ferran was remembered vaguely. Only one elderly villager, a florist, named Annie Crowthorne, recalled him. He bought white lilies every Tuesday, she said. Said they were for the altar, but he always asked for them to be wrapped discreetly. I thought it strange at the time. He had left town quietly, right before the nuns vanished, right before the convent shut down, right before the silence began. Then the second envelope arrived. This one wasn't dropped at the church. It was sent anonymously to Detective Mara Ellis, the lead investigator. Inside was a cassette tape, unlabeled, no return address. They found an old player, pressed play, and what emerged was a whispered, shaky voice, a woman's, barely above a breath. If anyone hears this, please don't let them say we ran. We didn't run. We were taken. He said it was holy. He said the child would be blessed. But it's not holy. It's a cage. We're not safe. Not from him. Not from the other one. The voice cut off with a sharp bang, like a door slamming. It was Sister Cecilia's voice, without question. Voice analysis confirmed it. But how had the tape survived? Who had sent it? Why now, a decade later? And who was the other one? Detectives began digging into the church's basement further, not just the grave site beneath the stone slab, but the hidden passages nearby. One led to a sealed confessional booth, and beneath the booth's platform, they found a rusted, locked box. Inside was a notebook, torn pages, illegible ink in many places. But what they could read was haunting, written in male handwriting. 4 flowers, all ripe for picking. They look to me for grace. I give them touch. The youngest bleeds when she prays. She says she sees angels now. I warned him not to intervene. I warned him he doesn't listen. No one listens, but they'll understand once the silence begins. The implication was obvious. Someone in the church, possibly Farron, had documented these horrific thoughts. But there was a twist. The page was dated after Farron had officially left Belwick, June 20th, 2 weeks after the disappearances. If he was gone, who wrote it? Or was he never really gone at all? The questions kept piling up, but one thing became increasingly clear. The disappearances weren't just about scandal. They were deliberate, coordinated, covered. Someone knew how to hide the truth, and someone, still alive, didn't want it uncovered. The notebook set off alarm bells at every level. It wasn't just disturbing. It was deliberate. Someone had written these thoughts with clarity, almost pride. But more chilling than the words was the handwriting. When compared with old church documents, prayer logs, and signed letters from the period, the results came back with a 90% match. Not to Farron, not to a stranger, but to Father Elric himself. Detective. Mara Ellis stared at the report like it had been printed in fire. She'd wanted to believe the older priest, the one who held the funeral, who wept at the altar, who said he failed the women but never harmed them. But if this notebook truly belonged to him, then everything shifted. It didn't mean guilt, not yet. But it cracked the mask. The team brought Elric in for formal questioning. He sat in a small room, hands folded, eyes heavy with something unreadable. When they placed the notebook in front of him, he didn't flinch. "That's not mine," he said. "I've never written those words." His voice was even, controlled, but his fingers twitched once, then stilled. Ellis leaned forward. She didn't accuse, not directly. "Then who do you think wrote it?" He looked up slowly and whispered, almost inaudibly, "I prayed they'd never find that." A silence filled the room, heavy, awkward. Then he added, "Because, if they did, he'd know I told, and he'd come back." That night, Father Elric checked himself into a private Catholic mental care facility outside the county. His lawyer said he was experiencing religious trauma, but the timing was too precise, too clean, almost as if he knew something else was coming. Back in Belwick, Ellis's team tore through church records again. They examined private correspondence, old surveillance logs, handwritten sermons, anything. Buried in a locked drawer in the chapel office was a single postcard, faded and dusty. On the front was a picture of St. Bartholomew's Monastery in upstate New York. On the back, 3 words: "You buried truth." No return address, no name, but the postmark, 1981, 1 year after the nuns vanished, and the handwriting, a perfect match to Father Romuald Farron. So Farron hadn't vanished, not completely. Someone in the church had kept tabs on him, or perhaps protected him. They found his name once in an obscure seminar attendee list in 1986, and once more, barely visible, in a hospital check-in log in 1983. But each time they got close, the trail ended. He was a ghost. Meanwhile, more journals surfaced. Sister Lucia's entries had been hidden in a hollowed-out hymnal found behind a false back in the chapel choir loft. Her words were raw, fearful. "He visits at night now. We lock the doors, but somehow he's always there, like he lives in the walls." Cecilia says, she heard whispering from the pulpit, not Elric, someone else. "It's not love, not anymore. It never was. He calls it divine, but it feels like drowning." Beatrice says, "If we tell, we disappear." I think she's right. The entry stopped one day before the nuns vanished, and tucked inside the back cover, scribbled, hastily, was a short line. "We buried it beneath the red window, all 4, so the light would remember us." That cryptic sentence led investigators to re-examine the stained glass above the altar, a crimson-colored rose window known locally as the blood bloom. Behind it was a narrow ledge, accessible only from the roof. There, hidden behind centuries of dust, they found a folded cloth wrapped tightly around something hard. Inside was a locket, tiny, silver, worn, engraved with a single name: Beatrice. Inside the locket were 2 things: a scrap of paper with initials, RSF, and a photograph, grainy, black and white, of a crib. But the child in the crib, it had his eyes, Farron's. For the first time, they had undeniable evidence, not just of manipulation, not just of spiritual abuse, but of a child. Proof that at least one nun had carried a pregnancy to full term. But where was the child now? Had the others carried to term too? Had any of them survived? Or had the church buried more than just bones? The photograph of the child changed the investigation. Until now, the focus had been on the women, their disappearances, the possible murder, the silence of the church. But now, investigators faced a more haunting question. Where is the child? DNA testing on the locket was slow, degraded over time, and tainted by exposure. But the results were clear enough. The hair caught in the hinge belonged to a female. The age range matched an infant, and the DNA profile, a partial match, belonged to Sister Beatrice. This meant she'd given birth and had kept the child long enough to leave this behind. But someone, at some point, had taken that child. There was no record of a baby ever being born at the convent, no hospital entries, no midwife reports, no baptismal certificates. The church offered no help, no comment. Then came a strange development. An anonymous tip came through to the sheriff's office. A woman claimed to be in possession of a sealed letter written by a dying nun who had once served in Belwick. She refused to give her name and insisted on speaking only to Detective Ellis. They met at a roadside diner 1 town over. The D. Woman, mid-30s, pale, nervous, handed over the envelope and walked out before Ellis could ask a single question. The letter inside was yellowed, shaky, written in blue ink with a trembling hand. "My name is Sister Agnes. I served in Belwick from 1978 to 1981. I was not part of the 4, but I knew. We all did. We just didn't speak. We were told not to. They said it would bring shame to the church, that we would be excommunicated. When Beatrice gave birth, it was in the underground chapel. Father Farron delivered the child himself. I heard her scream. I heard the baby cry. But when I came to check later that night, there was no baby, no crib, no Beatrice. Only Father Elric, sitting in the pews, eyes open, staring at nothing. He looked like a man who had seen hell and couldn't leave it. This was the first time someone had directly placed both Farron and Elric in the same moment, on the same night the child was allegedly born. Could they have worked together? Could Elric, all these years, have been covering for Farron? Or had he been manipulated too? More questions than answers. But Ellis pressed forward. She began to cross-reference adoption records, looking for children born between March and June of 1980, anywhere within a 100-mile radius of Belwick. Out of 61 births listed during that time, only one stood out. A baby girl, surrendered anonymously to a Catholic shelter in Albany. No parents listed, no history, just a note pinned to the blanket. She is of God. Let her be safe. The child had been adopted 6 months later. Her name was changed, with no traceable connection to the church. But when Ellis finally tracked her down, now a 25-year-old woman living in Maine, the resemblance to Beatrice was uncanny. Same cheekbones, same eyes, same calm gaze. Her name was Clara Rains, and she had no idea. Clara agreed to a private meeting. She didn't believe it at first. Who would? But when shown the photo of the locket, her breath caught. I've seen this in my dreams. This crib, that window, the red light. She broke down, crying. Something deep inside her remembered something she could never explain until now. A DNA test confirmed it. Clara Rains was the biological daughter of Sister Beatrice. She had survived. She was real. And now, unknowingly, she had walked back into the storm that birthed her. That night, Detective Ellis sat alone in the chapel, the lights off, the pews cold, the stained glass casting red shadows across the stone. She stared at the altar and whispered, more to herself than anyone, "Why didn't they run?" And a voice, soft, almost inaudible, echoed in her mind. Because they thought they were safe. Clara Rains sat quietly in the old pew. The chapel was smaller than she imagined. Ancient stones, cold walls, a ceiling that groaned under its own weight. This was where she was born, where her mother lived, where 4 women vanished. And somehow, she had found her way back, like a shadow returning to its source. Detective Ellis watched her from a distance. Clara had taken the news with eerie calm. She didn't scream, didn't run, just nodded, almost as if a part of her had always known, deep in her bones, that her life didn't start where she thought it did. The answers lay in the silence of this place. Clara walked the grounds for hours. She paused near the old garden wall, now overgrown with moss. Something about the layout felt familiar, like a dream half remembered. Then she spotted it, a carving on one of the stones. Lucia. She ran her fingers across the letters, barely legible through the moss, and just beneath it, a second name. Beatrice. The garden wall wasn't just a boundary, it was a memorial, an unspoken grave. That night, Clara stayed in the village. Ellis offered her a room at the rectory, but Clara declined. Instead, she found an old boarding house run by a retired teacher named Evelyn. Evelyn, as it turned out, had once taught all 4 nuns in Sunday school, back when they were just girls in white dresses, laughing in the village square. She remembered Beatrice best. Smartest of them all, quiet, kind, but there was something in her eyes near the end, something broken. She asked me once if God ever made mistakes. I told her no. Now I'm not so sure. Clara spent the next day digging through archives, church records, newspaper clippings, obituaries. But what struck her most was what wasn't there. No mention of the nuns' pregnancies, no funerals, no official investigations. It was like the church had erased them, wiped away their existence, not just from faith, but from history. Ellis arranged a second meeting with Father Elric, now staying under pastoral protection at a secluded facility. He looked tired, thin, like a man slowly unthreading. But when Clara walked in, something shifted in his face. He stared at her, not with surprise, but recognition. "You're hers," he whispered. "You look like her. Same eyes." Clara didn't waste time. "Did you know what happened? Did you see it?" Elric nodded barely, but he didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, "I tried to stop him, but I was weak and afraid. He said it was sacred. He said they'd be martyrs." Clara's voice broke. "Who? Farron?" Elric didn't answer, but tears slid down his face. Later that night, Ellis went over Elric's old sermons, hundreds of them. In one, dated just a week before the nuns disappeared, a strange passage stood out. "The rose blooms for those who bleed in silence, and the garden buries what the church cannot confess." The garden, where Clara had seen the names, they brought in ground-penetrating radar. Late into the night, they scanned the soil behind the garden wall, and what they found chilled them to the core. 3 disturbances, 3 plots side by side, not coffins, not deep, but large enough to hold human remains. The next morning, excavation began. Within hours, 3 more bodies were uncovered, skeletal, decomposed, wrapped in tattered cloth, each holding a rosary, each with initials carved into a scrap of wood: M, L, C, Miriam, Lucia, Cecilia. Only one was missing: Beatrice. The horror deepened. The original gravesite beneath the altar had clearly been a decoy, the church's attempt to close the case quietly. But this was deliberate, a secret kept in the soil, hidden in holy ground. And then came the final twist. Tucked between the ribs of one of the bodies, wrapped in wax paper, was a confession, handwritten, shaky, unsigned. "We were promised peace. We were told this was divine, but now he says we must go for God's plan to be fulfilled." He weeps when he says it, but his hands never shake. He says the blood will be cleansed by holy soil. I think he means to kill us. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was a match for Beatrice. They buried the 3 recovered bodies with full honors, no longer anonymous, no longer hidden. Miriam, Lucia, Cecilia, their names were etched into new marble stones beneath the stained glass that once watched them pray. But even as the town gathered to mourn, one question haunted everyone. Where was Beatrice? She was the heart of the story now, the only nun unaccounted for, the only one confirmed to have given birth, the only one who'd left behind a daughter, who'd unknowingly carried the weight of this story in her blood, and the only one whose body remained unfound. Clara refused to leave. She walked the grounds every day, retracing her mother's final days, her footsteps, her habits, her prayers. She started wearing a rosary of her own, not from faith, but for remembrance. Then something strange happened. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Clara wandered into the unused east wing of the chapel, a section long sealed off due to structural damage. Sunlight poured through cracked glass windows, dust swirling like memory. She paused near an old confessional booth and noticed a panel slightly ajar. Inside, nestled in the corner, was a loose floorboard. Under it was a locked wooden box. Inside that box were photographs, old, black and white pictures, not of the village, not of the chapel, but of a cabin, secluded, wooden, surrounded by pine trees and cliffs. In every photograph, the same figure appeared. A woman in a nun's habit, heavily pregnant, standing just outside the cabin's door. One photo had a name scratched on the back, B. Beatrice. The photos were dated June 15, 1980, 2 weeks after the nuns officially vanished. Beatrice had been alive, hidden, watched, and someone had been with her, taking these photos. Clara brought them to Ellis immediately. They cross-referenced the landscape. It matched a known stretch of abandoned forest 30 miles north, near the cliffs of Harrow's Cove, church-owned land, long since forgotten. They mobilized a team and, within a day, they found it. The cabin stood exactly as it had in the photos: rotten beams, broken windows, wild vines claiming the wood. But inside it was untouched, as if frozen in time. A single cot, a stained Bible, a ceramic mug on the fire windowsill, still faintly etched with the letter B. In the center of the room was a floor hatch. Ellis opened it carefully, heart pounding. A ladder led down into the earth, a cold crawl space barely 4 feet high. There in the corner was a wrapped shape, blankets, cloth, rosaries strung over it. Time had decayed the body, but the rosary was unmistakable. Its cross was engraved with the same initials found in Beatrice's locket: B.H., Beatrice Holloway. She had been hidden, not buried, preserved, protected. But why, and by whom? An envelope lay nearby. Inside was a final letter, addressed not to the church, not to the priest, but to Clara. To my daughter, if this ever finds you, know that you were not a sin. You were my salvation. I stayed alive as long as I could. I prayed they would let me raise you. But when they said no, I begged. He cried. Clara. He cried as he closed the door, but he still walked away. Forgive me for not fighting harder. Forgive me for not surviving. But remember this: you were loved before you ever breathed. Clara clutched the letter to her chest. For the first time, she cried. Not for herself, but for a mother who had been silenced, buried, forgotten, yet who never stopped trying to leave her something, even if it was just this one message. The state officially closed the case the following month. Miriam, Lucia, Cecilia, and Beatrice were formally acknowledged as victims of abuse and homicide. The church released a short statement. No apology, no responsibility, just a line: we pray for their souls. But for Detective Ellis, Clara, and the people of Belwick, the story was not over, because there was still one piece missing, one thread untied. What happened to Father Romuald Ferren? Where had he gone, and who had protected him? Ellis returned to Father Elric one final time. When she asked again about Ferren, he said nothing for several minutes. Then quietly, almost reverently, "He's where angels go when they fall. Buried, but not dead." Detective Ellis sat across from Father Elric for what would be the final time. This time she didn't bring evidence. No photographs, no reports, no recordings. Just one name: Romuald Ferren. The moment she said it, something inside the old priest collapsed. His eyes fell, his shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than ever. "You've been protecting him," Ellis said. "All this time." Elric didn't deny it. He just stared at the floor and whispered, "It started with God, but it ended with him." What followed wasn't a statement. It was a confession. The real story, the one no one had dared tell. Back in 1978, Father Romuald Ferren arrived at Belwick as a visiting priest from the Southern Diocese. He was charismatic, intense, deeply devout. And something about him mesmerized people, especially the young women at the convent. He spoke of divine connection, of the holy nature of love, of sacrifice as a sacred act. He preached sermons laced with poetry and mystery. When he looked at you, it felt like he was seeing into your soul. To the young, he seemed like a prophet. To Elric, who was then just 39 and deeply unsure of himself, Ferren was both a mentor and a storm. It began innocently. Late-night talks, spiritual questions, shared prayers. Then came the private meetings, the vows of silence, the claims that love, when sanctified by God, knows no sin. He told each of them they were chosen, that their bodies were vessels of holiness, that conception was not lust, but a divine calling. They didn't know he was saying the same things to each of them. By 1980, all 4 nuns, Beatrice, Lucia, Miriam, and Cecilia, were pregnant. It was Beatrice who first realized the truth. They weren't special. They were being manipulated. She confronted Farron, and he snapped. He didn't scream or hit her. He simply looked her in the eyes and said, "If you expose this, you condemn your sisters. If you tell, they die." Beatrice went silent, but Farron knew it wouldn't last, so he began planning. One by one, he isolated the women, told them the church was going to remove them, said their babies would be taken away. He offered a way out, a place of rest, a temporary retreat in the countryside where they could prepare for their role in God's greater plan. That cabin in the woods, it wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap. He brought them there under the guise of protection, fed them, prayed with them, and when the moment came, he poisoned them, slow, gentle, almost painless. 3 of them died peacefully. But Beatrice, she didn't drink the tea. She ran. That's when Elric stepped in. He had suspected things for weeks. He'd followed Farron that night and found Beatrice in the woods, sobbing, terrified, carrying her, newborn. She begged him to help, and he did. He took her back to the cabin, tended to her, fed her, listened to her story. But when Farron returned, Elric made a choice. He knelt before him and lied. "She's gone. She died. I buried her." But in truth, he hadn't. He helped Beatrice hide, built a room beneath the cabin floor, smuggled food when he could. But Farron grew suspicious. He returned weeks later, demanded proof, and Elric broke. He drugged Beatrice while she slept, left the child outside the chapel door in Albany, and sealed the crawl space with bricks and wood. "I told myself I was saving her, that it was the only way," he said, "but I buried her alive." Ellis couldn't breathe. "Why didn't you come forward?" Elric laughed bitterly. "Because no one would believe me. Not against him, not then. He disappeared, you know. Not just from Belwick, from everywhere. The church moved him, protected him, hid him under new names. And me? They told me to forget." Ellis had one final question. "Where is he now?" Elric looked her dead in the eye. "Buried under the chapel. No gravestone, no marker. But he's there." They dug. That night, beneath the choir loft, behind the sealed stone wall, they found a hidden tomb. Inside was a rotted priest's robe, a silver cross, and a skull. Father Romuald Farron had been dead for nearly a decade. Elric had killed him. It wasn't justice, he told Ellis. It was fear. Belwick had always been quiet, but now it was silent. Not the peaceful kind, the breathless kind, the kind that comes just after a scream. The truth was out. 4 women groomed and betrayed. A priest worshipped as holy, exposed as a predator. Another priest once revered, now confessed murderer and accomplice. The chapel, once a house of God, had become a graveyard of secrets. Clara stood inside St. Arabelle's, holding the letter her mother wrote, the one found beside her body in the crawl space. It was stained with time, nearly falling apart at the folds, but the ink had lasted. So had the love. "You were not a sin. You were my salvation," she whispered, reading it aloud one last time, like a prayer. Father Elric, now under protective custody, awaited trial. But Clara didn't hate him. He had been a coward, yes, but also a man drowning in fear, guilt, and sorrow. In his own broken way, he had tried to preserve what little hope remained. He buried a woman, yes, but he spared a child, and that child had now returned to finish what no one else could. The village of Belwick changed after the truth. People stopped calling it a quiet place. They started calling it a place of reckoning. Tourists came, reporters too. The Vatican issued a new investigation, a symbolic gesture more than anything. But for those who lived there, the scars were real. Clara didn't stay. After the memorial, a new gravestone was placed beside the others, one that simply read, Beatrice Holloway, Mother, Martyr, Light. She took nothing from the village except her mother's rosary and the photo of her as a young woman smiling in a garden. But Clara did leave something behind, a plaque mounted near the chapel gate. It reads, In memory of the women who were silenced, may their truth speak for generations. Detective Ellis filed her final report. Her last entry said, Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. This case will never fully close because you cannot close what was never meant to be hidden. But the truth is here now. For them, for Clara, for the rest of us. And the silence is over. A year later, a small foundation was formed, the Beatrice Trust. It supports survivors of abuse in religious institutions. Its motto, loved before you ever breathed. The chapel now stands empty, no priests, no sermons, no choir, but every Sunday, fresh flowers appear on the graves of Miriam, Lucia, Cecilia, and Beatrice. No one knows who brings them, but those who live nearby say that sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, they hear 4 voices, soft, sweet, and singing. Not hymns, not requiems, just peace.